Hello and welcome to another water cooler conversation, a safe space for the free exchange of ideas, brought to you by the Menzies Research Centre. I'm Nick Cater, the Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre, and today we look at the rise of the knowledge class and the cult of the university. A quarter of a century ago, the late Australian intellectual Pierre Ryckmans delivered the Boyer Lecture, in which he declared that our universities had passed the point of no return. Their decline would be complete, he said, on the day, not now very distant, when we shall see universities of catering, car driving instruction and car making. In 1996, when he spoke those words, fewer than 1 in 10 adults had a university qualification. Today, 30% of men and 38% of women have bachelor degrees or higher. And for adults under 40, the numbers are even more stark, 36% for men and 50% for women. It's a similar picture in Britain, the United States and Europe. And the consequences of this, according to my guest today, is the rise of a global cognitive elite, convinced that they're not just better educated, but better than their fellow citizens. David Goodhart joins me from London. David, welcome to Water Cooler.
Thanks, very happy to be here. As you can hear, my voice is slightly croaky today, but I have done a COVID test and I am not infected.
I don't think there's any known case of people catching it through Zoom call anyway, so I think we're fairly safe. I want to spend most of our time, David, talking about your latest book, Head, Hand, Heart, The Struggle for Dignity and Status in the 21st Century, in which you consider the far-reaching consequences of the rise of this knowledge class. But first, I just want to take you back to when our paths first crossed. I can't remember the year, but it must have been well before the internet, or well before we were downloading everything off the internet, because I was sitting in a pub in Cornwall with a rolled-up copy of Prospect magazine in my back pocket. You came over, and I recall you introduced yourself as the magazine's editor.
Oh, I remember that, yeah. It was Crackington Haven, I think.
Yeah, I can't remember the pub, but I remember the magazine, and I remember you. It was a very good magazine, and I think your first real venture into the world of ideas and editing ideas.
That's right. I'd been on the Financial Times for 12 years, and then I think partly through the experience of covering German reunification in the late 80s, early 90s, kind of gave me big ideas about starting a magazine, doing something more exciting with my life. And I was quite well connected with money people at the FT and with good writers. And it always seemed to me there was a hole in the market for one of those kind of essay-based magazines that we see in America flourishing. And so I set up Prospect in the mid-90s and edited it for 15 years. It's still going now. I don't have much to do with it any longer, but it's still there. I wanted to turn it into a kind of British Atlantic Monthly, and we never sort of quite broke through, but it's still there.
Well, it was a very, very good read, I remember, in your day. But you then went on, of course, to write a few books. The British Dream was an uncompromising look at the successes and failures of post-war immigration in Britain. And then, of course, you went on to write a book which became very well known here 4 years later, The Road to Somewhere, The Populist Revolt and the Future of Politics, in which you introduced this concept of somewheres and anywheres. I wish I'd thought of those words. I was searching for words. But could you just give, for those who haven't read the book or come across that, give us a brief summary of somewheres and anywheres and where that's a sort of foundational concept for this current book?
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to kind of understand the discontent that had arisen in our apparently very successful, rich, free societies. The kind of discontents expressed in Brexit vote here and the election of Trump in America and so on, the rise of populism in Western Europe. And I was looking at the education, or the value divides driven by education, particularly higher education, and how we'd seen the emergence not so much of a kind of narrow elite, but of a sort of mass elite of highly educated people who, who had at least an undergraduate degree. As you were saying earlier, I mean, now 30, 40% of the adult population in many developed countries, and how that tended to promote a certain set of priorities and values amongst the educated that were somewhat at odds with the values and priorities of those people who didn't go through the higher education system. One of those priorities, or one of those values, you might say, is mobility, and I think that's particularly true in the UK, because a very, very high proportion of people, even people who don't go to the most elite universities, still tend to go to residential universities. So people they leave home, they leave their family, they leave the town they were brought up in, and they travel, 100 miles, 150 miles. They go from, I don't know, London to Manchester or whatever. So it's sort of mobility is sort of built into their biography. So they tend to be comfortable with it. They tend to value, partly because of the values that universities are rightly there to promote. They value openness and autonomy, and they tend to be comfortable with rapid change. And that can often mean that they kind of rather look down on people who are uncomfortable with change. The people I call the somewheres. I mean, the anywhere. Obviously, this is a simplification, but I did spend quite a lot of time with my nose in attitude surveys and opinion surveys, and particularly the British social attitude surveys, which go back to the early 1980s, are quite a good source for this. There was, clearly the emergence of quite a large group, but still a minority, 25-30% of the population, very loosely the kind of anywhere section of society, which tend to be liberal-minded and tend to be comfortable with those notions of mobility, openness, autonomy, and so on. And there's a much bigger but much less influential group, the so-called somewheres, who tend to be less well educated, tend to value security and familiarity, and tend to have an identity, a sense of themselves that is derived from place and group, the group they belong to, the place they come from. And that makes them much more susceptible to being discomforted by change. There's this distinction, which I didn't invent. I think it's the American sociologist Talcott Parsons, who talks about human identities being on the spectrum between achieved and ascribed. Ascribed being those things about yourself you can't really change. I'm white, male, British, and achieved being the kind of sense of yourself that educated people often have, that sense that almost they're their own invention, that they've done well at school, they've gone to more or less good universities, they have more or less successful professional careers, and that makes their identity more sort of portable. They can kind of go, it's a more individualistic identity in a way, even if you have quite left-wing views, but your sense of yourself is derived from your own achievements, as the phrase implies. And also, I think, makes people with achieved identities, it makes it harder to understand people who are discomforted by change, because their identities are much more susceptible, as I say, to being discomforted by. If the place you come from changes, the group you belong to changes, that sort of part of you that is subject to that change, in a way that if you have a more achievement-based identity, you're sort of protected from that. So, I saw that conflict. But both of I should stress that both of these worldviews are completely decent and legitimate, at least in their mainstream forms. The problem, to the extent there is one, is that one of them has become far too dominant in our politics, culture, economy, society more generally. I mean, this is true in Australia as well as the UK. I mean, it's true in most developed countries. My book focused, most of the evidence was drawn from the UK, but I think the general argument applies to most rich liberal democracies. Yeah, like I say, that conflict, or rather the over domination of the anywhere worldview, and the feeling that many people on the somewhere side of the fence felt that they were being kind of excluded there, and often sort of derided.
Yeah.
And so, Brexit, Trump, and so on was a sort of pushback, an attempt to use democracy to kind of rebalance. Now, I mean, this is obviously big generalizations, and there are many different kinds of anywheres, many different kinds of somewheres. There's a big in-betweener group too. I identified about 25% of the population who kind of share the anywhere and somewhere worldview almost equally. And it's not, if you kind of, I mean, one of the reasons why the book did quite well was because I think those terms did strike a chord, and it sort of became almost a sort of parlor game. Are you an anywhere or somewhere or an in-betweener? It often doesn't work at the level of, most individuals are sort of too sort of complex and various to fit easily into the categories. But I think at a sort of broader level, it did help to explain some of what had been going on.
I think it did, and it resonated here, as does your analysis of the effect of this great expansion of higher education. Let me just play you a brief extract from an interview we recorded earlier this month with the former Australian Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, in which he talked about this.
Right now, our country does not need more marketing graduates. It does not need more arts and sociology graduates. Frankly, it probably doesn't need as many commerce or law graduates either. What we need more sparkies, chippies, we need more mechanics, we need more welders, we need more people who can actually do things, get things done, often enough with their hands. We need people who can build things, and yet we've got so many people who can talk about things but not necessarily make things happen. There are lots and lots of people who go to university, they spend 3 or 4 years of their life not getting any closer to a real career, not getting any closer to a real job, accumulating $50 or $60 or $100,000 in debt, and often enough filling their heads with leftist ideology. And I just don't think this is helpful for our country or for the individuals concerned.
So Tony Abbott then raised, I thought, 2 key points. One is that we have the wrong kind of skills. We've not got people with practical skills. We've got too many people with intellectual skills. Secondly, of course, he raises the point that it's commonly made that everybody, people out of university tend to come out with a very similar worldview. And that is not always a view, or very rarely a view, that's sympathetic to the conservative side of politics. Do you think that too is a function of the universities, and if so, is it a bad thing?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Tony Abbott is broadly right about all of that, and I make a similar argument in my book, Head, Hand, Heart. I think that there is a particular issue with the disappointed aspiration also of a lot of people that now go to university. What we've done in the UK, and I think to some extent in Australia too, is we've kind of massified an elite form of higher education, the forms of higher education that we associate with the kind of Oxford and Cambridges, which is a kind of 3-4 year full-time academic degree course, where you go, when you're 18 or 19, invariably in this country anyway, I think probably slightly less in Australia, residential, and in order to sort of justify all of the sort of academic palaver, the often quite vocational courses are sort of stuffed full, or I mean, sort of doing a construction management degree. It was only 5 seconds ago or a few decades ago when you became a construction manager by being a construction worker, having managerial ambitions, and you would probably learn construction management on site mainly. You might go and do some night classes or something. Now, I mean, it's not true in all cases, but there are construction management degrees where you spend 3 or 4 years kind of learning about accountancy and business studies and all sorts of other things, as well as what happens on construction sites. And this is often not particularly functional.
Well, no, you come out presumably with a lot of knowledge of management theory and not a lot of knowledge of shovels.
Yeah, and the other problem is that in recent years, and since we've been since we've hugely expanded higher education in the last 20 or 30 years, so that now almost half of school leavers in the UK go into higher education, you are obviously creating diminishing returns in terms of the graduate income premium. It used to be very high. Obviously, when I went to university, only 10 or 15% of the population went to university. It tended to be the kind of academically brightest people, or often actually people from some privileged backgrounds who had been well trained, or a combination of those two groups. And they obviously tended to monopolize the best professional jobs. And you now have a situation where so many people go to university that there aren't enough good, well-paid, highly respected professional jobs to go around. So, as well as all the other problems that Tony Abbott was talking about, the fact that we have I think probably in both our economies, a sort of crisis of the so-called missing middle, the kind of technical, the kind of the non-graduate engineer, the kind of technicians, the equivalent, the sort of lab technician type jobs that that we used to have things called HNDs and HNCs, higher national diplomas. The kinds of courses that plumbers and electricians did, and technicians of various kinds. The kinds of people that did those courses now go to university. The sort of children of the people that did HNDs and HNCs are going to college. And so the result of which is we have a huge crisis of, HGV drivers, technical, non-academic engineers of various kinds, various kinds of IT technicians. There's an absolutely huge recruitment crisis in these areas. The result of which, obviously, is that pay is going through the roof. Which is helping to realign this rather unbalanced system that we've got. In the meantime, however, I think we've created a whole generation of undergraduates, many of them from middling, even lower socioeconomic backgrounds, who are first in their family to go to university, who have been led to expect that they are, they've done everything asked of them, they've worked hard, and they've passed their exams, they've gone to college, but they're coming out at the end of it and finding they're not getting the high status, well-paid professional jobs that they were expecting, because there simply aren't enough of them. And this is even before AI really kicks in. And AI is coming precisely for the sort of lower and middle level cognitive jobs, in law, in accountancy, in medicine, and so on. So I think, as well as the sort of labour market misalignment, we're producing people with the wrong skills, and we have these crises of these sort of technician crisis, the crisis in the care sector too, but we're also creating a crisis of disappointed expectations. because we've reached what I call peak head. We're overproducing academically trained people, and many of them are not, but no more able in the general sense than the people who are not going to university. Obviously we need highly intellectually able people. I mean, the pandemic has shown the great value of our kind of medical scientific research base, people who are able to, clever people who collaborate in usually international teams to produce vaccines to combat COVID and so on. I'm not at all against high intelligence. We probably need it as a species more than ever before to help us solve problems like climate change and so on. But there's a sort of misunderstanding about this. I think the kind of belief propagated obviously by universities who have a massive self-interest in this, that somehow the more people you send to university, the stronger your research base becomes, the more sort of scientific breakthroughs you have, the more innovation you have. And there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that this is the case. Indeed, it could well be quite the opposite, that actually in the last 20 or 30 years, at a time when more and more people have been going to university, never before have research universities have had so much resource at their disposal. And yet we actually have a crisis of innovation. We have a crisis of productivity. We certainly haven't seen a great economic success story on the back of our expanded higher education sectors. Now, you may say that's slightly unfair. We've had, just looking back over the last sort of 10 or 15 years, we've had a global financial crisis. We then had periods of austerity in those countries. We now have the pandemic. So it's perhaps slightly difficult to tell. But, the work of, who's the guy in America? Is it Robert Gordon, the economist, who actually does argue that one of the reasons for the slowdown, this sort of secular slowdown in productivity, has been related to the kind of creation of a sort of cognitive bureaucracy that is a sort of dead weight on our economies.
I think that's right, David. I mean, you talk about this, how particularly on the left of politics, on the Labour side of politics, there's a tendency to argue in favour of a growth in higher education because it will make us more productive, it'll increase productivity. Well, we know that in Britain, as in Australia, productivity growth has declined and is slowing quite alarmingly. And yet, as you point out, you get many more people coming out of university than there are, decent jobs. So you get this phenomena with the creation of, what I call bullshit jobs, which tend to be sort of, in HR or compliance or various things like that. None of these jobs, it's a growth of the bureaucracy, but not in a helpful way. None of these jobs increase productivity. In fact, they slow them, don't they?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think the truth is, although, as the title of my book implies, I'm in favour of shifting status and reward away from just this one form of human capability, the kind of intellectual, analytical, and sort of spreading some of that prestige and reward more to the kind of manual, technical, and caring occupations. Having said that, I think that the people with the highest levels of kind of intellectual, analytical achievement will always be sort of at the pinnacle, and probably rightly so. The kind of Einsteins and the people that really do make important scientific, intellectual breakthroughs, technical breakthroughs of various kinds, but they're always going to be a tiny minority. And indeed, the kind of people who produce new knowledge will always be a tiny minority. And it's not, I don't think there's any necessary relationship between the number of people you send to university and the production of new knowledge. And clearly you need a fair system. So, and people often confuse these two largely separate issues. The issue of the bright kid from the poor background. This is often held up as the reason for the overexpansion of higher education. That we're kind of providing more ladders up to the bright kid from the poor background. I don't actually think there's any evidence for that. I think there have always been ladders up. Indeed, I think go back 50 years or 100 years, our societies were characterized by lots of little ladders up. And indeed, I think the way that we think about social mobility is deeply flawed in many ways. We tend to think of that long ladder from the disadvantaged inner city background or whatever, sort of single parent household, going up to, Oxford and Cambridge, or whatever your equivalent of Oxford and Cambridge is. But actually, social mobility is far more importantly described as often quite small movements. Somebody perhaps from a kind of manual working class background who moves up sort of a couple of rungs of the ladder through acquiring a professional technical qualification. Spreading that through society is much more important than having small numbers of people climbing the long ladder. But the people at the top who tend to dominate this argument are either people who climb that long ladder themselves or who've been sitting at the top of the ladder because they come from privileged backgrounds, and there's a sort of narcissism about it. It's all going to become like us. Actually, that isn't going to happen. It logically cannot happen on any significant scale. So I think we need to, obviously, we want a system that is as fair as possible, that is, people with great intellectual ability and indeed curiosity should be able to express that from whatever background they come from by going to good, really rigorous academic universities, which of course is also something that's been sacrificed with the massification of higher education. Most universities are no longer great centres of intellectual learning. They're sort of sausage factories, really. But we want, if anything, a smaller, more rigorous, intellectually superior higher education system, and then a much more differentiated system of vocational colleges of various kinds for people requiring post school training of various kinds. Because I go back 30 or 40 years, the vast majority of professional people didn't go to university. You did, if you were a lawyer, you did your kind of articles, I think they were called. They were kind of like professional apprenticeships, whether you were an accountant, a lawyer, or whatever. And I don't think anyone is saying that standards of law or accountancy have kind of risen dramatically as a result of people doing these courses at university rather than sort of on the job.
David, there's a very important corrective in your book, a corrective in the debate, I think. You talk about how the rise of this cognitive elite, people, as I said at the beginning, not imagine themselves, by and large, not just to be better educated, but better people. And they, so as a result, you get a whole lot of discontent amongst people who are not in that knowledge class. And we've seen examples of that in the last 10 years or so. The deplorables, Trump supporters, Brexiteers, we have the equivalent here, people who vote for one nation. And the narrative has been, or the explanation has been, these are the people who've missed out on wealth. They're people that have been left behind by globalization. It's an inequality of wealth. And yet you make the point in your book that the real issue here is not an inequality of wealth, but an inequality of esteem. That Britain, like Australia, was a fiercely egalitarian country in which every person had equal worth. But now that is disappearing, and people feel that they're ignored. Let me quote from your book: A successful society must balance the tension between the inequality of esteem that arises from relatively open competition for highly rewarded jobs, and the ethos of equality of esteem that flows from democratic citizenship. This is crucial, and it does seem to me, when you listen to people who are want to drain the swamp, or they feel that their views are disrespected, that they are disrespected as people, that nobody takes them as serious individuals. Is that right?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think there's always been sort of liberal sneering at the less well-educated and people who have, like sort of group attachments or attachments to the nation and the flag, and these have always been seen by many of the highly educated, particularly on the kind of left liberal side of things. There's always been that sneering, and I guess it's partly just a sort of quantity thing. I mean, the more people that go to through higher education and come out as with kind of left liberal values, the more sneering you're going to get. But I do think we've ended up sort of with the worst of all worlds, haven't we? I mean, that sense, because we've focused so much on one form of success, the academic ladder to the elite university and into the higher professional job, we've inevitably drawn away status and reward from other functions and left a lot of people feeling that their contributions are not valued, or not valued as much as they would have been in perhaps are in some ways less open, less democratic societies of, say, 50 years ago. But what people had then often, I think, was they weren't ever going to get into the elite or anywhere near it, but they were still making a contribution to the country's success. And this has obviously got tied up in deindustrialization. If you were a working class man in South Yorkshire 50 years ago, you were sitting on top of one of the great coal fields of Western Europe. You went to work in your local mine. Thanks to the militancy of the mining union, you probably were quite well paid. Indeed, you were actually right at the top of the kind of manual earnings league in the 60s and 70s. But more than that, you knew that you were powering the country, and just with the kind of the nature of kind of industrial geography meant that you had those high status and in some ways quite high paid manual jobs spread out all over the place, all over the country. So you had steel mills everywhere. You had big utilities everywhere. You had you had mines spread out over the Midlands and the North, particularly, and so alongside this kind of narrowing of prestige and reward into information handling, essentially, you've also had the kind of narrowing of sort of successful areas, productive and successful areas, into the great metropolitan centres, particularly London and the southeast, and that sort of exacerbated. You've had a kind of geographical and a sort of intellectual, educational narrowing of prestige, and that sense, as I say, that it's much harder to feel that you're making a positive contribution to the country unless you're going through that kind of that narrow route into academic success.
Yeah, and it's just been this assumption in public policy that higher education was just a good thing on both sides of politics. You talk about the Blair government, but equally well the Conservative government that followed it has been heading down this path, and so too in Australia, but never any real thought in detail as to how it will benefit the country. But here's the point. People have worked this out, haven't they? You quote some research by a British think tank that asked people, has encouraging more people to go to university and fewer people gaining technical qualifications been good or bad for the country? And roughly a third, 34%, said it had been good. So the rest, 2/3, didn't think it had been. But here's the thing, David, we did our homework. We did the same question here this week, a poll of thousands of Australians conducted by Compass Polling, and the result was even more stark. Here, just 21%, barely a fifth, said the expansion of higher education and the downgrading of technical qualifications had been good for Australia. So, and interestingly, when you look at the age numbers there, the feeling is pretty high amongst young people too. There's a little bit more support. It does decline to get older. So why is this? How is this perpetuated year after year after year, this sort of expansion of higher education, when quite obviously it's not fully justified in policy terms and people don't like it?
Well, I think it's a very good example of my kind of road to somewhere thesis about the over domination of a certain group, the people I call the anywheres, and the assumptions of that group. They have all gone through higher education and moved into higher professional jobs. Their children are all in the process of doing the same or have done the same. And that is how they see the world. And they have to see that as beneficial for everybody. They place this great stress. This is why we have these fraught and often very ill-informed debates about social mobility. They see that long ladder up as being the sort of that is the sort of gold standard of social mobility success, and that sort of salves their conscience on this issue. But actually, what this leads to is this one of the most ridiculous public policy contradictions between. So we sit here, excuse me, particularly in the UK, wringing our hands about grotesque regional inequality that we have. Since the closure of all those industries that I was just talking about, we have had even more concentration of kind of wealth and success in London and the southeast, and one or two other metropolitan centres, but mainly London and the southeast, and a few university towns, the Oxfords and the Cambridges, Bristol, and we have the worst regional inequality in Western Europe, I think, or comparable, I think, with Portugal. And yet, at the same time, the political class that rightly worries away about this, is also promoting a parallel policy, which is that all the bright kids from whatever background should go to university, which means that all the brightest kids from working class towns, the Mansfields and the Rotherhams and the Rochdales and the Berries and the 20 or 30% of the brightest kids every year are leaving those places. Again, this is particularly a UK thing because the dominance of residential universities here. They're leaving, and many of them are never going back. They're ending up in London. They're going into higher professional work, and so we're exacerbating the problem. If you lose all your brightest people, then companies are not going to want to go and invest there because they're not going to have that range of abilities that any company needs, and it's going to set up a successful operation of some kind. Of course, one of the problems is, and for the last 20 or 30 years, we've also not had decent alternatives. That is one of the things. I think you probably do slightly better on this than we do, but and everyone, of course, talks about the great German model with their wonderful duales Ausbildung system. And it's true. They still about 45-50% of school leavers in Germany go into a really good, well-structured 2.5-3 year formal apprenticeship system, and they often then go on to go through higher education as well. And there's no reason why we couldn't do something similar. We don't have the same institutions that Germany has, so we'd have to do our kind of own version of it. But we've really had very, very poor and much less well subsidized alternatives for those people who do not climb the academic ladder, people who don't want to or cannot because they have abilities, but they're not very good at passing exams. They don't have that kind of ability. The options for those people in the last couple of generations have been dismal. We destroyed our apprenticeship system back with the industrialization in the 60s and the 70s. and we've had a kind of confusing mess of vocational qualifications. Now, finally, actually, and the Boris Johnson government has contributed to this, although it goes back a bit earlier too. We now do have more of a structure. We have an apprenticeship levy. We have something called T levels, which is a vocational alternative to academic A levels. We have recent government initiatives in supporting, subsidizing anybody who wants to train to the equivalent of A levels in vocational or academic routes. Is entitled to state support for that. We're extending the student loan scheme to people who want to do things other than the standard 3 or 4 year academic course, so that people can draw on those loans for vocational courses too. You want to do a 6-month coding course, whatever, and move into software, you will be able to get a government loan. So we now, we've got sort of coding boot camps that are springing up all over the place. There is much more, I think, partly reflecting the disappointment with the outcomes for so many graduates, or at least graduates who are not coming out of the very elite universities are, like I said earlier, there's been a sort of collapse in the inevitable diminishing returns, collapse in the graduate income premium for people, for all those not going to the most elite universities, and the jobs not being there for them. So I think we are, the ship is sort of changing direction, and I think things are now. One of the problems here, even persuade. I mean, there have actually been more recent polls than the one I quoted in the book, which reinforce. I mean, it used to be the case almost all parents wanted their kids to go to university because that was what everybody. That's what everybody told you every time you turned on the radio or TV or heard a teacher talking about it. That was the single route to success. I mean, we've now weaned ourselves off that ridiculous idea, I think. And now more parents in the UK, according to a recent poll, would prefer their kids to do a vocational qualification and go to university. So that the kids themselves seem to take a slightly different view, because university is, still that idea of kind of 3 years away from your parents, basically kind of getting drunk and having sex. I mean, and who wouldn't want to do that at the age of 19? No, and I think one of the answers to that, and I think there is something to be said. I mean, quite a few academics say that actually the main benefit of higher education is not so much what you learn, because there's a huge amount of evidence suggests, outside of some narrow vocational fields, that basically everyone that goes to university forgets what they learned within about 18 months. But the kind of the old adage that sort of education is what is left after you've forgotten everything you ever learned does, I think, have some truth to it. But more important, the notion of, particularly in residential universities, living with, learning to cooperate with people of often very different backgrounds to you, socially, ethnically, is quite a good thing. And it's not for everybody. Some people are more kind of home types, and some people do want to kind of spread their wings and fly away. But I think the answer there is to kind of make this residential experience available to everybody, not just undergraduates. Make it available to, say, people doing apprenticeships. With the internet, it should be easy to everybody, to allow people, so long as you probably need your accommodation subsidized, but allow that every year, say there's a couple 100,000 apprentices who do their apprenticeship away from home, perhaps indeed living in the same student halls as people doing undergraduate degrees, and they could all kind of meet each other through kind of internet networks and so on.
Mm. David, look, you have this wonderfully optimistic concept in there, a peak head, the idea that there'll be a correction. And look, I get that. I can understand that at the level of changing the education mix and the focus and the investment in education, more skills, more broad-based courses, more crossover courses between universities and skills courses. I get that bit, but I frankly cannot see the cognitive class, the cognitive elite, giving up the reins of power anytime soon. In fact, in every respect, they seem to be strengthening their grip on it.
Well, it is true. I mean, the number of kids going to university continues to rise, and there are these vested interests, as we've already discussed, both the universities themselves, which are increasingly businesses, they just have a huge vested interest in, more bums on seats, and a political class that has been through that system and has, and is sort of biased in favour of it. But I think the kind of raw economics, my meaning of peak head is that we've now got to a point of overproducing cognitively trained people for jobs that are simply not there, and this is going to get worse when AI comes in. Now we do need, many highly cognitively trained people still. Excuse me. But if you look at the top two social classes in the UK, I mean, I think it's the professional and managerial class, higher and lower. The number of adults, working age adults, who are in that group in those two classes in the year 2000 was 35%. Last year it was 36 or 37%. I mean, it barely moved at all. So, we went through a period of rapid expansion of that sort of profession, mainly sort of cognitively trained professional managerial class. We went through a rapid, as no doubt you did in Australia too, we went through a rapid expansion of that group, which is why we did need to expand our universities, at least in the UK. We had this very, very narrow, back in the 1950s, there was still essentially Oxford and Cambridge, and a few of the so-called red brick universities that had emerged in the 19th century in the great industrial centres that tended to specialise in sort of industrial chemistry and things like that. You then had, it wasn't really till the 60s, you had the Robbins Report universities and quite a big expansion then. And that, I think, was entirely justified. I mean, it's horses for courses. We needed more professional, cognitively trained people. We were expanding education, expanding higher education itself, expanding the welfare state and public services. A lot of those jobs, think of all the doctors and all the professions related to medicine. We did need it. So I'm not, we needed it to expand it, and we then, like so many things, we over-expanded it. And now the raw economics will pull us back, and the kids are noticing it. The kids will stop going to university because, I mean, particularly here, you acquire £56,000 worth of debt. Admittedly, you don't have to pay it back till you're earning reasonably well, but it's quite, we have still quite generous terms, and much of the debt never will be repaid. But still, people are noticing that actually, people they know are not going to university. They're doing a coding course, they're working in a digital startup, and it seems to be quite fun, and they're earning a lot more money. And also, the possibility that you could do that 5-10 years or so. And then if you are actually intellectually curious and intellectually able, you might want to know what it is that kind of lies behind what you've been doing every day for the last 10 years. Go and do a computer science degree. Later on, do it down the road. Because it's this concentration of so much post-school education investment in 18, 19-year-olds going to university. Spread it out more over a lifetime. I still think the higher education sector is probably too big, but actually, if people start going at different points in the life cycle, it may not have to shrink that much. It just has to kind of repurpose itself, and indeed rediscover some of the kind of idealism of intellectual curiosity and discovery. And someone in their late 40s. Taking a break from work for 2 or 3 years and going off and reading George Eliot, or finding out about studying Sanskrit or something that has no kind of immediate labour market value, but is extremely stimulating thing to do.
Well, David, thank you for your book, Head, Hands, Heart, published by Penguin Random House. And thank you for really, I think, stimulating a well overdue discussion here. We're going to be taking it up at the Menzies Research Centre. COVID, I think, has brought together and brought to a point a lot of the problems that we're facing at university. There's going to be a new model, I suspect you agree, after COVID. So we'll be looking at this in more detail. But David, it's a great book, and thank you for joining us from London on Water Cooler.
Well, thank you. It is out in paperback as well, by the way, so it's relatively inexpensive.
Terrific. Even students can afford it. That's fantastic news. So that was Water Cooler. Thank you very much for joining us. We want to produce more of these. We need your help. And the best way you can help is to subscribe to the Menzies Research Centre from just $10 a month. Go to menziesrc.org/subscribe. I'm Nick Cater. Thank you for joining us.